The grease under Roy's fingernails never quite washed out anymore. He scrubbed his hands in the back sink of Mama Rita's diner, watching the gray water swirl down the drain. His shift at the repair bay had run long, and now he was late for his evening job serving tables. 2 jobs meant 2 paychecks, and 2 paychecks meant his debt might disappear before he turned 40. Rita poked her head through the kitchen door. Her wrinkled face showed concern mixed with exasperation. Table 6 needs water. Table 3 wants their bill. And someone just walked in with kids. Roy dried his hands and grabbed his apron. The diner occupied a forgotten corner of Terminus Station, where the lighting fixtures flickered and the air recyclers hummed too loud. Most customers were freight workers or maintenance crews grabbing cheap food between shifts. The occasional alien stopped by, usually the ones who had developed a taste for human cooking or were too broke to care what they ate. He pushed through the kitchen door and surveyed the room. Table 6 was easy, just a tired-looking couple sharing fries. Table 3 was already standing with credits in hand. But Table 8 made him pause. Drakari sat hunched in the corner booth, trying to make herself small. Roy had seen exactly 3 Drakari in his life, all from a safe distance. They were massive creatures, reptilian and powerful, with wings that could shred metal and claws designed for killing. This one had scales the color of old copper, dulled and patched in places. Her wings were folded tight against her back, the membranes torn along the edges. 2 small shapes huddled close to her, their heads barely visible over the table edge. Roy delivered the water and the bill, then approached Table 8 with his order pad. The mother Drakari watched him with golden eyes that held exhaustion deeper than physical tiredness. Her children, both younglings with scales that should have gleamed but instead looked chalky and dull, stared at the laminated menu like it contained secrets of the universe. "What can I get you?" Roy kept his voice level and friendly, the same tone he used with every customer. The mother's voice was rough, like gravel sliding down metal. "The soup. 1 bowl. And bread if it comes with it." Roy glanced at the younglings. They were thin, their small frames showing the outline of bones beneath loose scales. The little one, barely bigger than a human toddler, had patches on their hide where scales had fallen off and not grown back. "That's 1 bowl for 3 of you. We share." The mother's claws scraped against the table surface, leaving small grooves in the plastic. "Is that a problem?" "No problem." Roy wrote down the order. "The soup comes with 2 bread rolls. I'll bring 3. He turned before she could respond and walked back to the kitchen. Rita was already ladling the soup, a thick vegetable stew that was more filler than flavor, but hot and filling. "They look hungry," Rita said quietly. "Yeah." Roy grabbed 3 bread rolls from the warmer and put them on the tray. "Real hungry." He brought the food out and set it down carefully. The mother immediately pushed the bowl toward her children. They ate with desperate efficiency, their small claws gripping the spoons awkwardly. She broke the bread into pieces, giving each child a portion before taking a small piece for herself. Roy watched from behind the counter as she chewed slowly, making the bread last as long as possible. The other customers kept their distance. A Voss trader at table 2 got up and moved to a seat further away. A human couple with a young daughter left quickly after paying, casting nervous glances toward the Drakari family. Roy understood the fear. Drakari had a reputation. They were warriors, hunters, predators at the top of the food chain on their homeworld. But looking at this mother and her starving children, all Roy could see was desperation. 30 minutes later, the bowl was empty. The children had eaten most of the soup. The mother had taken maybe 4 spoonfuls. She cleaned her claws carefully with a napkin, then reached into a worn pouch hanging from her belt. She pulled out a handful of credits and counted them on the table. Her movements slowed. She counted again. Then a 3rd time. Roy walked over with the bill. He set it down face up and saw her expression collapse. The meal cost 8 credits. She had 6. "I thought I had enough." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I counted before we came. I was certain." The younglings sensed something wrong. The smaller one made a soft chirping sound, pressing closer to their mother. The other child, slightly bigger, looked up at Roy with eyes that were trying very hard to be brave. "I can work," The mother said quickly, I can clean tables. Vaish dishes. I am strong. I can lift things. Please, I just need to work off the difference. Roy looked at the 6 credits on the table. He looked at the children. He looked at their mother, who was offering to do manual labor for 2 credits worth of soup. The meal is 8 credits, Roy said. Several other customers were watching now. But we have a special today. Family meals are 6 credits. The mother stared at him. That was not on the menu. New special. Just started. Roy scooped up the 6 credits. You folks have a good evening. He walked back to the counter before she could respond. Rita was watching him with an expression he could not quite read. Behind him, he heard the scrape of the booth as the Drakari family stood to leave. That comes out of your pay, Rita said. I know. You don't even know them. I know they were hungry. Roy put the 6 credits in the register and added 2 of his own to balance it. Rita shook her head but said nothing more. Roy glanced back at table 8. The mother was guiding her children toward the door. The smallest youngling looked back over their shoulder, golden eyes wide and curious. Roy raised his hand in a small wave. The child ducked behind their mother's leg, but kept watching until the door slid shut behind them. The rest of the evening passed in the usual rhythm of orders and clearing tables. But Roy kept thinking about those 3 faces. He kept thinking about how the mother had eaten almost nothing so her children could have more. He kept thinking about scales that should have shone, but instead looked like old paint peeling from metal. When his shift ended, Roy walked back to his quarters through the dim corridors of the lower station. He passed by the docking bay where small personal crafts sat in various states of repair. One ship in particular caught his eye, a tiny Drakari transport with scorch marks along the hull and a door that did not quite close properly. The registration marks were faded, and one landing strut was bent at an angle that looked painful to see. Roy stood there for a long moment, then continued home. He did not know it yet, but the choice he had made in the diner, the simple decision to let 3 hungry people eat, had started something that would change his life completely. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest kindness. Sometimes feeding someone soup is enough to shift the whole universe just a little bit sideways. And sometimes a mechanic who just wanted to pay off his debts ends up becoming something much more important than he ever planned to be. 3 days had passed since the dinner incident, and Roy was elbow deep in a coolant system when the alarm started screaming. The repair bay filled with flashing red lights, an automated voice announcing emergency protocols. Around him, other mechanics dropped their tools and backed away from their workstations. Roy pulled his head out of the engine compartment and looked toward the emergency dock. Through the observation window, he could see smoke pouring from a ship that had just attempted to land. The vessel was small, barely bigger than a personal shuttle, and it was clearly Drakari in design. Flames licked along the port side where the fuel lines had ruptured. Seal the bay. The shift supervisor was already hitting controls. We follow protocol. Let burn out. Roy wiped his hands on his coveralls. There might be people inside. Drakari can handle fire better than we can. If they survive, we'll extract them after it's safe. The supervisor's hand moved toward the emergency seal button. Roy looked at the ship again. The hull was familiar, covered in the same scorch marks and dents he had seen 3 nights ago in the docking area. His stomach dropped. He moved before he could think about it, grabbing a fire suppression pack from the emergency wall and running toward the airlock. Chin, get back here. That is an order. But Roy was already cycling through the airlock. The suppressant pack was heavy on his back, and his hands shook as he checked the seal on his breathing mask. The heat hit him the moment the inner door opened. Even through his protective gear, he could feel the temperature spike. The Drakari ship sat at a terrible angle. One landing strut completely collapsed. Fire poured from the engine housing, spreading along the fuel lines toward the main cabin. Roy ran forward, pulling the suppression nozzle free. The foam sprayed out in a wide arc, smothering the flames closest to the cabin door. Smoke made everything hard to see. His eyes watered despite the mask. He circled the ship, coating the worst of the fire, buying time. The cabin door was jammed, warped from heat. Roy dropped the suppression pack and grabbed a pry bar from his belt. He jammed it into the door seal and threw his weight against it. The door shrieked open and smoke billowed out. Roy pulled his shirt up over his nose and looked inside. The mother Drakari was slumped over the control panel, unconscious. Burns marked her arms and chest. Behind her, through a narrow passage, Roy could hear crying as he climbed into the cabin. The space was tiny, designed for Drakari proportions, but cramped even for them. Roy grabbed the mother under her arms and pulled. She was incredibly heavy, her muscle and bone density far beyond human normal. His back screamed in protest as he dragged her toward the door. Step by step, he moved her out of the ship and away from the flames. Other mechanics had gathered at the bay entrance, watching through the sealed door, but none of them moved to help. Roy laid the mother down on the deck, plating, and ran back to the ship. The crying was louder now. Roy squeezed through the narrow passage to what looked like a cargo area, converted into living space. Two small shapes huddled in the corner, pressed against the wall. Pip and Ash, the younglings from the diner, stared at him with terrified golden eyes. "It's okay," Roy said, though he knew they probably did not understand much human speech. "I'm getting you out." He scooped up the smaller one first, feeling the child's claws dig into his coveralls as they clung to him. The youngling was shaking, making high-pitched sounds of distress. Roy carried them out quickly, setting them down next to their unconscious mother, then ran back for the second child. Ash was bigger and fought him at first, scared and confused. Roy spoke in what he hoped was a soothing tone, finally getting an arm around the youngling and half-carrying, half-dragging them out of the dying ship. The moment Ash saw their mother and sibling, they scrambled free and pressed close to them. Roy stood there breathing hard, his lungs burning from smoke despite the mask. The fire was mostly out now, reduced to smoldering patches. Behind the sealed bay door, he could see his supervisor on a communication panel, probably calling medical services. The mother Drakari stirred. Her eyes opened and immediately found her children. She tried to sit up, making a sound of pain. Roy knelt beside her. "Stay down. Medical is coming. You breathe in a lot of smoke." She focused on him, recognition flickering across her face. "You, from the eating place." "Yeah, from the diner." Roy checked her burns. They looked bad, but not fatal. Drakari were tough. "My younglings, they're fine. Scared but fine." She closed her eyes, and Roy saw moisture gathering at the corners. "The ship is destroyed." "Pretty much, yeah. I have nothing left." Her voice was flat. "No ship, no money, no way to leave." The bay door finally opened and medical personnel rushed in with a stretcher. Station security followed, their weapons drawn despite the obvious lack of threat. Roy stood back as they loaded the mother onto the stretcher. The younglings tried to follow, but a security officer blocked them. "They need to stay with their mother," Roy said. "Protocol requires separation until we assess the situation," the officer replied. Drakari juveniles can be dangerous when distressed. Roy looked at Pip and Ash. They were huddled together, shaking and making small distress sounds. Dangerous was the last word he would use to describe them. He made a decision that was probably stupid. "They're with me. I'll take responsibility for them." The officer frowned. "You can't just, I can and I am." Roy moved between the security officer and the younglings. "They're coming to medical with their mother. If you have a problem with that, you can file a complaint later." The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds before the officer shrugged and stepped aside. Roy turned to the younglings. Pip was crying, tears making tracks through the soot on their small face. Ash was trying to be brave, but their whole body trembled. "Come on," Roy said gently. He held out his hands. After a moment, Pip reached up and grabbed one hand. Ash took the other. Their claws were sharp, but they were careful not to hurt him. They followed the stretcher through the station corridors to the medical center. Other people moved out of their way, staring at the sight of a human mechanic holding hands with two Drakari younglings. Roy ignored them. He kept his grip firm and steady, letting the children know he was not going to let go. In the medical center, they laid the mother in a treatment pod. The doctor, a Voss with 4 arms and professional detachment, scanned her quickly. "Smoke inhalation. 2nd-degree burns. She will recover with treatment." The mother's eyes found Roy through the transparent pod cover. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you keep helping us?" Roy thought about the question. He thought about the empty soup bowl and the 6 credits. He thought about the burned ship and 2 terrified children. He thought about how easy it would have been to just follow protocol and stay safe. Because you needed help, he said simply. That's enough reason. She stared at him like he had just spoken in a language she did not understand. Maybe he had. Maybe kindness was a foreign language to someone who had spent their life running and surviving. But the look in her eyes was changing, shifting from confusion to something else. Something like hope. The doctor cleared his throat. She needs rest. You should take the juveniles to a waiting area. Roy nodded and gently guided Pip and Ash to a bench outside the treatment room. They sat on either side of him, pressed against his legs like they were afraid he might disappear. Through the window, Roy could see their mother in the treatment pod. Her eyes were closed now, but her breathing was steady. Somewhere in the station, administrators were probably already filling out deportation orders. Somewhere, protocols and regulations were being followed. But sitting here with two scared children who had no one else, Roy realized that sometimes following the rules was not the same as doing the right thing. And he was starting to understand that doing the right thing might end up costing him more than he ever expected to pay. Station Administrator Portman had an office that tried very hard to look impressive. The desk was real wood, imported from Earth at enormous expense. The walls displayed certificates and commendations. Everything was arranged to remind visitors that Portman was important and his decisions mattered. Roy sat in the cheap plastic chair across from that expensive desk and listened to the administrator explain why Sarah and her children had to leave. It's quite simple, Mr. Chun. Portman folded his hands on the desk. The Drakari female, Sarah is her name apparently, has no means of support. Her vessel is a total loss. She possesses insufficient credits to book passage elsewhere. Station regulations are clear about indigent aliens. She's not indigent. She was working. Roy kept his voice level. She had a job lined up on the far colonies. The ship breaking down wasn't her fault. Nevertheless, she cannot remain here without means of support. Portman pulled up a document on his screen. I'm giving her 48 hours to arrange departure. If she cannot, she will be transported to a processing facility. Roy knew what processing facilities meant. There were prisons in everything but name, places where unwanted aliens were held indefinitely. What about her kids? They would accompany her, naturally. Naturally. Roy tasted bitterness in the word. So a mother and two children who haven't done anything wrong get locked up because their ship broke. Portman's expression hardened. Mr. Chun, I understand you feel some misplaced sympathy. But Terminus Station cannot become a refuge for every down-on-their-luck alien who arrives here. We have limited resources. The Drakari require specialized nutrition. The younglings would need educational accommodations. The insurance costs alone for housing a Drakari family are substantial, right? It's about money. It is always about money. That is how stations function. Portman leaned back in his chair. I made my decision. 48 hours. Roy left the office before he said something that would get him arrested. He walked back to his quarters in the lower levels, his mind working through problems and solutions. Sarah had been released from medical that morning. She and the younglings were staying in a temporary shelter, a converted storage room with sleeping mats and basic facilities. He found them there, all three crowded together on one mat despite having access to three. Sarah looked up as he entered, her golden eyes holding a resignation that made something in his chest tighten. They told me, she said quietly. 48 hours to leave. Roy pulled up a storage crate to sit on. Pip and Ash watched him with the same hopeless expression as their mother. What if you didn't have to leave? I have no ship, no money, no way to earn money in 2 days. What if you could earn money here? What if you had a job? Sarah made a sound that might have been a laugh if it held any humor. Who would hire a Drakari female with younglings? I have asked at 30 places. The answer is always the same. Too much risk. Too much liability. Too expensive. Roy had spent the previous evening doing research. He had learned things about Drakari physiology that most humans never knew. They could withstand extreme temperatures that would kill other species. Their scales provided natural protection against radiation. Their strength was enormous, and they could fit into spaces that would require specialized equipment for others to access. The station needs maintenance workers for the plasma conduits, Roy said. The radiation levels are too high for most species. We usually send in robots, but they keep breaking down. A Drakari could do that work safely. Sarah stared at him. I know nothing about plasma conduits. I would teach you. I'd supervise the work. My boss has been complaining about the robot failure rate for months. Roy leaned forward. And Mama Rita at the diner needs help. She's getting old. She needs someone strong to move supplies, handle heavy equipment. You could work there during the day, then do maintenance work in the evenings. And my younglings? The station has a learning center. It's free for residents. They could go to school. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Pip crawled in her lap, and she absently stroked the youngling's head. Why would you do this? Why would you risk your job, your reputation, to help us? Roy thought about the question. He could give her a logical answer about labor shortages and efficiency. He could talk about humanitarian principles. But the truth was simpler and more complicated at the same time. Because you're a good mother, he said finally. I watched you give your food to your kids. I watched you fly a dying ship because you were trying to get them somewhere safe. You're not asking for charity. You're not looking for handouts. You just need a chance. Tears gathered in Sarah's eyes. In Drakari culture, Roy would learn later, crying was considered a profound display of trust. Predators did not cry in front of potential threats. I do not understand humans, she whispered. In my world, weakness is death. Asking for help is shameful. But you see us at our weakest, and you help anyway. Maybe that's the difference, Roy said. We don't see asking for help as weakness. We see refusing to help as the shameful thing. The next morning, Roy brought Sarah to meet his supervisor at the repair bay. Doris was a short woman with gray hair and a permanent scowl, but she was fair. She listened to Roy's pitch about using Drakari workers for radiation-heavy maintenance. She could get hurt, Doris said, looking Sarah up and down. Drakari radiation tolerance is significantly higher than human, Roy replied. I checked the medical database. The levels in our conduits would not even register as uncomfortable for her. Doris turned to Sarah. You ever done maintenance work? No, but I learned quickly, and I am very strong. To demonstrate, Sarah picked up a tool chest that usually required 2 people to lift. She held it easily in one hand. Doris raised her eyebrows. All right, trial period. 2 weeks. Shin supervises. Any problems, and she's gone. Thank you, Sarah said. The words sounded like they meant more than just gratitude for a job. Mama Rita was easier to convince. She took one look at Sarah lifting a supply crate full of canned goods and hired her on the spot. Can you start tomorrow? My back's been killing me. The school administrator was less enthusiastic. Drakari younglings? We've never had Drakari students before. Then this is a good chance to start, Roy said. Pip's already reading basic standard. Ash has artistic talent. They're smart kids who deserve an education. The administrator clearly wanted to refuse, but the station charter guaranteed education access to all resident children regardless of species. Fine. But the first sign of behavioral problems, there won't be any, Roy said firmly. That evening, Roy stood in the doorway of his quarters looking at the empty space. His apartment was small, just 2 rooms and a bathroom, but it was larger than the storage room where Sarah and the younglings were staying. He made another decision that was probably stupid that he found them back at the shelter and made his offer. You can stay with me, temporarily, until you save up enough for your own place. Sarah looked shocked. That would be inappropriate. You have done too much already. I have a couch. You and the kids can have a bedroom. It's not permanent, just until you get on your feet. Roy met her eyes. Nobody should have to live in a storage room. Sarah looked at her younglings. They stared at Roy with wide, hopeful eyes. She took a shaky breath. I will pay rent. As soon as I am able. Sure, we'll work it out. They moved in that night. It was awkward at first, none of them sure how to share space with each other. Pip and Ash explored the quarters with cautious curiosity. Sarah stood in the middle of the main room, looking lost, like she could not quite believe this was happening. Roy showed them where everything was, how the shower worked, what to find food. He set up the bedroom for them and took the couch for himself. It was uncomfortable and too short, but he had slept in worse places. That night, lying in the dark, Roy heard soft sounds from a bedroom. Sarah was crying, trying to be quiet about it. He heard her whispering to her younglings in their own language, the words gentle and loving. Roy stared at the ceiling and wondered what he had gotten himself into. He was now responsible for 3 Drakari who had nothing but each other and the charity of a stranger. It was reckless and impractical and probably going to cause him endless problems. But somewhere in his chest, beneath the worry and the doubt, Roy felt something he had not felt in a long time. He felt like he was doing something that mattered. Something more important than paying off debts or fixing ships or just getting by, that he was giving someone hope. And maybe that was worth all the complications that were sure to come. The first week was chaos. Roy woke up to the sound of Pip crying because they had a nightmare. He learned that Drakari younglings made a chirping sound when they were happy and a low rumble when they were scared. He discovered that Sarah barely slept, staying awake most nights watching the door like she expected danger to burst through at any moment. But slowly, things began to settle into a rhythm. Roy taught Sarah how to read diagnostic panels and safety protocols. She absorbed information like a sponge, asking questions and taking notes in a small book she carried everywhere. Her natural strength made the physical work easy. Jobs that would take human workers hours to complete, she finished in minutes. Within 3 days, she was working independently in the lower radiation zones, the diner. Mama Rita watched Sarah reorganize the storage room with something approaching awe. 30 years I've been trying to reach that top shelf, Rita said. You just pick up the whole crate like it's empty. Sarah ducked her head, a gesture Roy had learned meant embarrassment. It is not difficult. Maybe not for you. For me, it's a miracle. Rita patted Sarah's arm. The gesture would have been dangerous with most Drakari, but Sarah only looked pleased. You're good people. I don't care what anyone says. The younglings adapted to school with mixed success. Pip excelled at mathematics and science, often finishing assignments before the teacher finished explaining them. But they struggled with social interaction. Other children were scared or mean, keeping their distance or making cruel jokes. Ash had the opposite problem. They understood people instinctively, making friends with the quiet kids who sat alone at lunch. But the academic work confused them. Letters and numbers seemed to dance around on the page, refusing to stay in order. Roy started walking the younglings to school each morning. His presence stopped most of the bullying. The kids who might have thrown insults or pushed them around thought twice when a full-grown human was watching. Roy hated that it was necessary, but he was glad he could do it. One afternoon, Roy came home to find Sarah in the kitchen area attempting to cook. She had found a recipe database and was trying to follow instructions for human food. The result was a smoking pan and a strange smell that made his eyes water. I wanted to make dinner, she said, looking miserable. To thank you, but I do not understand your food. Roy opened a window to let out the smoke. How about I teach you? We can cook together. They stood side by side at the small stove, Roy explaining how to adjust the temperature and when to add ingredients. Sarah's claws made holding utensils awkward, but she adapted quickly. By the end, they had produced something that was actually edible. Pip and Ash returned from school and stopped in the doorway, staring at the table where Roy had set out plates of food. Ash made a small, questioning chirp. We eat together, Roy said. That's what families do. Sarah's head turned sharply. Family. Roy realized what he had said. He could backtrack, clarify that he meant it loosely. Instead, he met her eyes. Yeah, family. That night was the first time Sarah ate a full meal. She still made sure the younglings had plenty, but she did not ration herself down to nothing. Roy watched her take second helpings and felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with the food itself. The second week brought new challenges. A ship docked carrying a family of Krellians, insectoid beings who took one look at the Drakari in the diner and left immediately. A station merchant filed a complaint about Sarah, claiming her presence scared customers. Administrator Portman sent Roy a message reminding him that this arrangement was temporary, but there were good moments too. Sarah received her first paycheck and stared at the credit chip like it held the secrets of a universe. I earned this, she said quietly. It is mine. You worked hard for it, Roy agreed. I want to pay rent, and buy food, and get clothing for the younglings. She looked up at him, and I want to pay you back. For the dinner. For everything. The dinner was 8 credits. Don't worry about it. It was not about the credits. Sarah's claws tapped against the table, a nervous gesture Roy had learned to recognize. In my culture, when someone provides for your younglings, it creates a debt of honor, a bond. Roy did not fully understand Drakari culture, but he could hear the weight in her words. You don't owe me anything, but I do. She placed the credit chip on the table between them. My life, my younglings' lives. Everything we have now exists because you chose to help when no one else would. Before Roy could respond, the door chimed. He opened it to find Pip standing in the hallway, tears streaming down their small face. Ash stood behind them looking angry. What happened? School kids, Ash said. Their voice was rough with emotion. They said bad things. About Mama. About us. Roy knelt down to Pip's level. What kind of bad things? Pip hiccuped through the tears. They said we're monsters. That we eat people. That we shouldn't be here. Sarah appeared in the doorway, and both younglings rushed to her. She gathered them close, her wings spreading slightly in a protective gesture. Her eyes met Roy's, and he saw the pain there. She had expected this. Of course she had expected this. I will speak to the school, Sarah said quietly. We'll both speak to them, Roy corrected. Tomorrow morning. The meeting with the school administrator was tense. The woman sat behind her desk, looking uncomfortable as Roy explained what had happened. Children can be cruel, she said, but we can't control what they say outside of class. Then control what they say inside class, Roy replied. Teach them that different doesn't mean dangerous. Teach them that Drakari are people, not monsters. Our curriculum doesn't include xenobiology, then change the curriculum. Roy kept his voice level but firm. Pip and Ash are students here. They deserve to feel safe. The administrator looked at Sarah. What about your perspective? How do your people handle integration? Sarah was quiet for a moment. My people do not integrate. We conquer or we isolate. There is no tradition of living peacefully alongside other species. She looked down at her claws. But I want my younglings to have a different life. I want them to learn cooperation instead of domination. Something in the administrator's expression softened. I'll speak to the teachers. We'll address the bullying directly. And I'll look into expanding our cultural education program. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. That evening, Roy found Pip drawing at the kitchen table. The youngling had covered a sheet of paper with careful sketches. Roy looked closer and realized they were pictures of the apartment. The couch where he slept, the kitchen where they ate. Sarah and Ash and himself, all together. That's really good, Roy said. Pip looked up at him with golden eyes that still held sadness from earlier. Is this home? The question struck Roy harder than he expected. He thought about his small apartment that he had always seen as temporary. He thought about how it had been empty before, just a place to sleep between shifts. Now it held life and noise and the smell of cooking food. Now it held 3 people who depended on him. Yeah, Roy said. This is home. Pip smiled. It was like watching the sun come out after weeks of rain. Sarah appeared from the bedroom, where she had been helping Ash with homework. She heard Roy's answer, and something changed in her expression. The constant wariness that she carried like armor seemed to ease just slightly. That night, Roy lay on his couch and listened to the sounds of his apartment. Sarah moving quietly in the bedroom. The younglings breathing in sleep. The hum of the station around them. It was far from perfect. There were still problems to solve and prejudices to overcome. Administrator Portman still wanted them gone. Other residents still looked at them with fear or suspicion, but they had jobs and food and a place to sleep. They had each other. And maybe, just maybe, they were starting to build something that looked like a real life. Roy closed his eyes and let himself imagine a future where this strange, impossible family could actually work, where a human mechanic and a Drakari mother and 2 younglings could just exist without constantly fighting for the right to stay. It seemed impossible. But then again, 3 weeks ago, it would have seemed impossible that he would be sharing his home with 3 Drakari. Impossible things seem to be happening a lot lately, and Roy was starting to think that maybe impossible was not the same as wrong. Maybe impossible just meant that nobody had tried hard enough yet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, everyone was safe and fed and together. Tonight, that was enough. The Drakari diplomatic vessel arrived on a Tuesday morning without warning. Roy was at work when his communication device buzzed with an urgent message from Sarah. 3 words: "They found us." He dropped his tools and ran. Through the repair bay, down 3 levels, across the crowded market district to the temporary housing where Sarah had been scheduled to work that morning. A crowd had gathered outside. Station security formed a loose perimeter. And in the center of it all stood a Drakari male who made Sarah look small. Ambassador Crawl was enormous, nearly 3 meters tall with scales that gleamed like polished obsidian. His wings were pristine, unmarked by damage or age. He wore formal diplomatic bands around his arms and neck, symbols of authority in Drakari culture. Next to him, Administrator Portman looked nervous and very, very small. Roy pushed through the crowd. Sarah stood facing Crawl with Pip and Ash pressed behind her legs. Her posture was submissive, head down and wings folded tight. Every line of her body screamed fear. "What's going on?" Roy demanded. Portman turned to him with obvious relief. "Mr. Chun, Ambassador Crawl has come to retrieve Sarah and her offspring. Apparently, there are legal complications." "Legal complications?" Roy looked at Crawl. "She's a refugee. She left legally." Crawl's voice was deep and resonant, the kind of voice that expected obedience. "The female Sarah is property of the Drakari hegemony. She departed without authorization and removed 2 juvenile assets. This constitutes theft." "Assets?" Roy felt anger rising in his chest. "They're her children. They are future soldiers of the hegemony." Crawl's golden eyes fixed on Roy with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "The female is a deserter. Under interspecies treaty, she must be returned to face judgment." Portman held up a datapad. "I've reviewed the treaty. Ambassador Crawl's claim has legal standing. Sarah is technically classified as a refugee without status. The hegemony has jurisdiction." Roy turned to Sarah. She was shaking, her claws digging into her palms hard enough to draw blood. "What happens if you go back?" "They will take my younglings," she whispered. "Place them in training camps. I will be sent to labor colonies." She looked at Pip and Ash with devastation in her eyes. "I will never see them again." "That's insane. You can't just separate families." "We are not family," Crawl interrupted. "We are Drakari. Younglings belong to the state from age 3 onward. It is our way." Roy looked at the crowd. Station residents watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to satisfaction. A few looked uncomfortable. Most looked like they thought this was someone else's problem. Nobody stepped forward to help that. He looked at Portman. "There has to be something we can do. An appeal process. Legal protection. For a recognized refugee? Yes. But Sarah has no formal status." Portman actually looked apologetic. "My hands are tied." Roy spent the rest of that day in the station's legal archives. He read treaty documents and citizenship laws until his eyes burned. There had to be a solution. There had to be some loophole or provision that could protect Sarah and the younglings. Finally, near midnight, he found it. A clause in Human Federation law about family unit protection. Citizens could sponsor family members for residency, including adopted dependents. The law was meant for human families, but the language was broad enough to potentially include other species. But there was a catch. The younglings would need to be legally recognized as part of a human family unit. And Drakari law did not recognize split families. If the younglings were adopted, Sarah would need to be included in the family structure as well. The only legal framework that allowed for that was formal bonding. Marriage. Roy sat back in his chair and stared at the screen. He barely knew Sarah. They had lived together for 3 weeks. He was a mechanic who could barely pay his own debts. She was a Drakari refugee with 2 children. This was insane. But the alternative was watching 3 people he had come to care about be torn apart and destroyed. He went home and found Sarah sitting in the dark. The younglings were asleep in the bedroom. She looked up as he entered, and he could see she had been crying. "I am sorry," she said. "I brought this trouble to you. I will leave tomorrow. Perhaps if I surrender myself, Crawl will leave the station and you will be safe." "I'm not worried about being safe." Roy sat down across from her. "I found something. A possible way to stop Crawl." Hope flickered in her eyes. "What way?" Roy explained the law. He explained the family unit protection and the adoption process. He watched her expression shift from hope to confusion as he got to the complicated part. You would need to be legally bonded to me, Roy said carefully. It will be a formal arrangement, legal only, to protect the kids. Sarah stared at him. Bonded? You mean as mates? Not really. It's different for humans. We call it marriage, but it could be just a legal contract. People do it for lots of reasons beyond romance. Roy ran his hand through his hair. I know it sounds crazy, and I know we barely know each other, but it's the only way I can think of to keep your family together. You would do this. Her voice was barely a whisper. You would bind yourself to a Drakari female and her younglings? Take on that burden. It's not a burden. Roy met her eyes. Sarah, I've watched you work 2 jobs without complaint. I've watched you give everything you have to your kids. I've watched you be braver than anyone I've ever met. If anyone's getting a bad deal here, it's you. In my culture, bonding is sacred. It is a lifetime commitment. In human culture too, usually. But this would be whatever we make it. A partnership, a legal protection. We'd figure out the rest as we go. Sarah was quiet for a long time. The younglings would be yours. In the eyes of the law, I'd be honored, and I would be your responsibility. Your mate, even if not in truth. We'd be responsible for each other. That's how partnerships work. She looked toward the bedroom where Pip and Ash slept. They call you Papa Roy already. Perhaps they have known longer than we have what you would become to us. Is that a yes? Sarah turned back to him. You would face judgment from your people. Dating or bonding with aliens is not always accepted. I've never been good at caring what people think. The hegemony will consider this an insult. They may cause problems for you. They're already causing problems. At least this way you and the kids are safe. Sarah reached across the table and placed her clawed hand over his. The gesture was careful, mindful of the sharp edges. Then yes, I accept your offer. I will bond with you to save my family. Roy felt the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. He was about to tie his life to 3 Drakari he had known for less than a month. It was reckless and impulsive and completely insane. IT was also the most right thing he had ever done. The next morning, they went to the station's legal office. The clerk looked at the bonding application like it might explode. Human and Drakari? I've never processed one of these. Then we'll be your first, Roy said. The ceremony was quick and bureaucratic. Portman served as witness, looking uncomfortable but legally obligated. Sarah repeated the words in her rough voice. Roy repeated them back. The clerk stamped the documents. Just like that, they were bonded. The adoption papers for Pip and Ash took even less time. Roy signed his name, and suddenly he was legally their parent. The younglings watched the process with wide eyes, not fully understanding, but sensing something important was happening. An hour later, Ambassador Krall stood in Portman's office holding the bonding certificate like it was something obscene. This is a mockery, a fraud to circumvent legitimate claims. It's a legal bonding recognized under Human Federation law, Portman said. He did not look happy about it, but he stood firm. Sarah is now a recognized family member of a human citizen. Her younglings are adopted dependents. They fall under Federation protection. Krall's scales seem to darken with rage. The hegemony will not forget this insult. You harbor deserters and thieves. I harbor a family, Roy said. He stood next to Sarah with Pip and Ash between them. And that family is under my protection now. Krall stared at them all. The massive Drakari ambassador and the human mechanic. The refugee mother and her frightened younglings. Finally, he bared his teeth. You have made an enemy today, human. The hegemony has a long memory. So do I, Roy replied calmly. After Krall left, the station seemed to exhale. News of the bonding spread through the corridors like wildfire. Roy's communication device exploded with messages. Some were congratulatory. Many were hostile. A few were threats. Mama Rita was the first to visit. She hugged Sarah carefully, then turned and hugged Roy hard enough to crack his ribs. I knew you were good people. Both of you. Others came too. Doors from the repair bay brought a bottle of something alcoholic and toasted their health. A Voss merchant who had previously avoided the diner brought gifts for the younglings. Even some of the neighbors who had complained about Sarah's presence stopped by with awkward well wishes. That night, Roy stood in his apartment, now legally married to a Drakari woman and father to two younglings. It was completely insane. It was possibly the dumbest thing he had ever done. Pip climbed into his lap, purring contentedly. Ash showed him a new drawing, this one with all four of them labeled as family. Sarah sat nearby, watching her children with an expression of peaceful relief Roy had never seen on her face before. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for giving us a future." Roy looked at his strange, impossible family and realized something. He had spent years trying to pay off debts and get ahead. He had measured his life in credits earned and obligations fulfilled. But this, right here, this was the first time he felt truly wealthy. "Thank you for trusting me," he replied. In minute, with everything he had 0.6 months changed everything and nothing at all. Roy still worked at the repair bay, though he had been promoted to senior mechanic after Sarah's efficiency improvements in the radiation zones led to a station-wide upgrade in maintenance protocols. Doris had grudgingly admitted that hiring Drakari labor was one of the best decisions they had made in years. Sarah now headed the entire hazardous maintenance division. 3 other Drakari refugees had arrived at Terminus Station after hearing about the family that had found safety there. Sarah hired them all, trained them herself, and ran her department with a fairness that earned respect even from those who had initially feared her. Mama Rita's Diner had become something of a gathering place for mixed-species families. The old woman had expanded the menu to include foods suitable for different metabolisms. Business was better than it had been in a decade. Rita claimed it was her cooking that brought people in, but everyone knew it was the reputation of the place. The diner where a human and a Drakari had first shared kindness. Pip had advanced 2 grade levels in mathematics and was being considered for an accelerated learning program. Their scales had regained their full luster, gleaming copper in the station lights. The other students had stopped bullying after Pip helped a struggling classmate pass a critical exam. Turns out being good at math made you popular when finals came around. Ash had discovered an aptitude for art that surprised everyone. Their drawings covered the walls of the apartment, colorful depictions of station life and the people in it. The school had entered one of Ash's pieces in a regional competition. It won second place. The art showed a human and a Drakari standing together under stars, holding hands with 2 small younglings between them. The judges called it a powerful statement about unity and acceptance. Roy sat in their new quarters, larger now, with an actual bedroom for him instead of just the couch. The family had saved enough to upgrade, though Sarah had insisted on keeping costs reasonable. She still watched every credit carefully, unable to shake the habit of survival mode. "You're thinking too hard," Sarah said. She settled onto the furniture next to him, careful as always about her weight and size. "I can hear your thoughts from across the room. Just thinking about how different things are now. Different good or different bad?" "Different good." Roy looked at her. They had settled into a comfortable partnership over the months. Not romance, though sometimes Roy caught himself wondering what if. But something deeper than friendship. A bond built on mutual respect and shared responsibility. "I never expected my life to turn out like this." "Neither did I." Sarah's claws traced patterns on the armrest. "I expected to die running, or to be caught. I never expected to find safety. And I certainly never expected to find it with a human. Humans are full of surprises. So I have learned." She paused. "There is something I need to tell you. More Drakari are coming. More refugees. Yes, word is spread through the underground networks. There is a place where Drakari who flee the hegemony can find work and safety, where humans will help instead of turning us away." Sarah looked troubled. "I received a message today. A group of 7 are requesting permission to settle here. 2 families and a lone male. That's good, isn't it? More people who need help. It is complicated. The station administrators are already concerned about the Drakari population growing. Portman has been receiving pressure to limit immigration." Roy thought about it. 6 months ago, Terminus Station had 0 Drakari residents. Now, there were 4, soon to be 11. "We'll figure it out. We always do. You have too much faith in solutions. You don't have enough." Roy smiled. "That's why we work. I am optimistic. You're practical. Between us, we get things done." Pip burst through the door, home from school, and vibrating with excitement. Papa Rai, Mama, I got selected for the advanced program. They want me to start next term. Sarah gathered Pip into a hug, purring with pride. Roy joined them, and Ash appeared from their room to add to the pile. For a moment, they were just a family celebrating good news. Species did not matter. History did not matter. Just the joy of a child succeeding. Later, after the younglings went to bed, Roy found Sarah on the small balcony that overlooked the station's central plaza. She stood watching the people below, a mix of dozens of species going about their evening routines. "I've been thinking," she said as Roy joined her, "about us, about what we are." Roy's heart beat faster. "Yeah, when we bonded, it was a legal arrangement. Protection for my younglings. A way to circumvent the hegemony's claims." She turned to look at him. "But it has become more than that. You are my partner in truth, not just in documentation. I feel the same way. I need you to understand something about Drakari culture." Sarah's voice was serious. When one Drakari provides for another's younglings, when they stand as guardian and protector, it creates a bond deeper than simple friendship. You have become what we call a clutchmate, a chosen family member. I like that term, clutchmate. There is more. Cela exclut de nervously. In our culture, clutchmates who raise younglings together are considered true bonded pairs. Regardless of how the relationship began, the bond becomes real through the act of raising young together. Roy processed that. So, in Drakari terms, we're actually married? Not just legally, but culturally. Yes. Sarah watched him carefully for his reaction. "I understand if this makes you uncomfortable. It was not what you signed up for." "Sera." Roy took her hand, carefully avoiding the sharp claws. "I didn't sign up for any of this. I didn't plan to share my apartment with 3 Drakari. I didn't plan to become a father. I didn't plan to stand up to a Drakari ambassador. But I did all of it, and I would do it again in a heartbeat." "Why?" "Because you're my family. All 3 of you. And family means you show up, even when things are hard. You commit, even when it's scary. You choose them every single day." He squeezed her hand gently. "So, if our relationship is real in Drakari culture, then I'm honored. Because it's real to me, too." Sarah made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You ridiculous, wonderful human. You have no idea what you mean to me. To all of us. I think I have some idea." They stood together on the balcony, watching the station live and breathe around them. Below, Roy could see mixed species families walking together. A human child holding hands with a Voss parent. A Krellian merchant sharing food with a Terran customer. Small moments of connection that would have been rare a year ago. "Did you ever imagine this?" Roy asked. "When you were running from the hegemony, did you imagine finding a place like this?" "No. I imagined survival. Day-to-day existence in the shadows. I imagined my younglings growing up always afraid, always hiding what they were." Sarah's voice grew soft. "I never imagined them being happy. I never imagined them thriving. They're amazing kids. You raised them well. We raised them well," Sarah corrected. "I could not have done this alone. I was failing when you found us. The ship was dying. Pip was getting sick. I was out of options." She looked at him. "You gave us more than shelter and food. You gave us dignity. You saw us as people worth saving. You were always worth saving. I just happened to be paying attention." Sarah rested her head against his shoulder, careful of her horns. The gesture had taken weeks to perfect, learning how to be physically close without accidentally hurting each other. Now it was natural, comfortable. "The new refugees who are coming," Roy said. "We'll help them too. Find them work. Get them settled. Build a real community here. It will not be easy. There will be resistance. There's always resistance. But look around." Roy gestured at the plaza. "Change happens anyway. One person at a time. One family at a time. You think we can change the galaxy? One mechanic and one refugee. I think we already have. Maybe not the whole galaxy, but our corner of it, definitely." Sarah purred, the sound rumbling through her chest. It was a sound of contentment, of safety, of home. "I'm glad I came to that diner. I am glad I was foolish enough to order soup I could not afford. Best 8 credits I ever spent. Si crédit sera corrected." There was a special, remember? They both laughed. Inside, they could hear Pip and Ash talking in their room, arguing about something trivial in the way siblings do. Normal family sounds, ordinary and precious. Roy thought about the path that had led him here. A struggling mechanic working 2 jobs to pay off debts. A chance encounter with a desperate mother and 2 hungry children. A series of small choices that had snowballed into something much larger. He had become a father, a husband, a symbol of change on a forgotten station in the middle of nowhere. He had never intended to be a revolutionary. He had just wanted to help. But maybe that was the secret. Maybe revolution was not about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Maybe it was about noticing when someone needed help and choosing to provide it. Again and again, day after day, until the world shifted just enough to let something new grow. "Come on," Roy said. "Let's go inside. I think Ash want to help with their art project. And Pip needs to practice reading in standard." They still stumble over the irregular words. They walked inside together, partners in the most important work they would ever do. Raising younglings, building a family, creating a space where differences were not feared but celebrated. The station hummed around them. Somewhere, new refugees were packing their meager belongings and heading toward Terminus, hoping the rumors were true, hoping that humans were strange enough to help even when it made no logical sense. And in a small apartment in the lower levels, a mechanic and a Drakari mother put their children to bed, read them stories, and tucked them in with gentle claws and careful hands. They whispered good nights in 2 languages and turned off the lights. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. More refugees to help. More prejudices to overcome. More moments where the choice would be between the easy path and the right path. But tonight, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. A family, strange and impossible and absolutely real, safe and together in a home they had built from kindness and courage. And that was more than enough. That was everything.